The air in the farmhouse was thick with the scent of rain and earth, that heavy stillness before a storm. The old clock on the wall ticked in uneven beats, echoing through the small room where Thomas Avery lay dying. His face, once weathered by sun and laughter, was now pale and drawn. Years of toil had stolen the strength from his hands, the same hands that had built every fence post, plowed every acre, and held his daughter close when her mother died. Beside his bed sat Clara Avery, his only child. Her eyes were red from tears she refused to shed again. She had been strong for days, running the farm, keeping neighbors fed during the sickness, and caring for her father, but the fight was slipping out of her. She clutched his hand, her heart breaking at how light it felt in hers. Standing in the doorway was Elias Boone, the cowboy who'd worked the Avery land for nearly 5 years. He wasn't much for words, a quiet man with broad shoulders, sunburned skin, and eyes the color of worn denim. He had come west with nothing but a horse and a past he never spoke about. Yet somehow he'd found a kind of home here, helping Thomas through hard seasons. When Thomas saw him, he lifted a trembling hand. "Elias, come here, son." Elias stepped forward, hat in hand, his boots creaking on the wooden floor. "I'm here, sir," Thomas coughed, breath rattling in his chest. "You've been more than a hand to me. You've been family. You know the land. You know her ways. Promise me. You'll see the harvest done." Elias's jaw tightened. "You have my word." Thomas's cloudy eyes drifted toward his daughter. "And promise me you'll look after Clara. She's strong, but too proud for her own good." Clara tried to protest. "Pa," but he hushed her with a faint smile. "You'll need help, girl. This land don't yield to one pair of hands." Elias hesitated. The weight of the request sank deep into his bones. He had long hidden the truth of his heart. The way Clara's laughter softened his hardest days. The way her strength and stubbornness reminded him of every reason he'd stayed on this land. Looking into Thomas's face, he knew this wasn't just a dying man's plea. It was a sacred charge. He knelt beside the bed. "Mr. Avery, I give you my word. I'll see your crops harvested. I'll keep her safe." Thomas's lips curved faintly. "I know you will." His eyes fluttered closed, and for a moment, the room went utterly still. Outside, thunder rolled across the fields. A gust of wind pushed through the open window, stirring the curtains. Clara gripped her father's hand tighter, whispering, "Don't go yet, Pa. Please." But his chest rose once, then fell for the last time. She bowed her head against his shoulder, silent tears falling. Elias stood back, hat pressed to his chest, unable to speak. After a long moment, he moved closer and gently drew the blanket up over Thomas's still face. "He's at peace now," he said quietly. Clara didn't answer. The storm broke outside, rain drumming against the roof, mingling with her quiet sobs. When she finally looked up, Elias met her eyes. He wanted the harvest done. "I'll see to it," she nodded weakly. "You don't have to—" "Yes," he said softly, cutting her off. "I do." As lightning flashed over the prairie, Elias stepped out into the rain, staring across the wide fields, rows of grain swaying in the wind, soaked and heavy. The harvest would be backbreaking, maybe impossible, but he had made a promise, and to a man like Elias Boone, a promise was as binding as blood. That night, the storm raged, but in the small farmhouse, a vow had been born, one that would shape the lives of two souls bound by loss, loyalty, and a love neither dared to name. The days after her father's death passed in a blur for Clara Avery. The neighbors came with casseroles and condolences, each one murmuring the same hollow words. "He was a good man. You'll be all right, dear," before slipping away. When the last wagon rolled off down the muddy road, silence settled over the farm like a shroud. The farmhouse felt too big, the fields too wide. Every creak of the floorboards reminded Clara that her father's boots would never sound there again. She tried to busy herself, washing dishes, tending the chickens, mending clothes, but grief clung to her like dust. Every morning at dawn, she would stand by the kitchen window and look out toward the horizon. There, without fail, Elias Boone appeared, a dark figure riding through the mist, his horse moving slow and steady. He never asked permission to come. He simply worked. Clara watched as he rode out to the far end of the property, where the wheat grew thick and gold. From sunrise until the stars came out, Elias labored, repairing the plow, clearing the storm debris, checking the fences. He never spoke much, only tipping his hat when she came near. At first, she told herself she didn't need him, that she could run the farm herself. Her father had taught her enough, how to seed, when to reap, how to tell good soil from bad. She was proud of that, fiercely so. Yet pride didn't keep the tractor running or the bills from piling up. One afternoon, when she went to the barn to fetch feed, she found the broken wagon wheel she'd left there the week before, already mended. The bolts tightened, the paint fresh. On the workbench lay a folded note in a man's rough handwriting. Didn't want to wake you. Fixed what needed fixin'. Clara stared at it for a long while, her throat tight. She didn't know if she was angry or grateful. That night, over a simple supper, she sat alone and tried to make sense of Elias Boone, a man who seemed carved from quiet strength. He'd made her father a promise, yes, but what kept him here now? Was it duty or pity? By the end of the week, whispers began to ripple through the small town of Cedar Bluff. Folks at the general store talked when they thought she couldn't hear. That cowboy's there every day. A single woman and a hired hand. Ain't proper. Maybe he's after more than harvest. Each word landed like a thorn. The next morning, Clara rode into town for supplies. When she entered the store, the conversation hushed. Mrs. Branson, the banker's wife, gave her a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You're brave to be staying on that place alone, dear," she said. "But I suppose you have help." Clara's cheeks burned. She paid for her flour and sugar without a word, then rode home fast, the wind biting at her face. That evening she found Elias by the barn, fixing a gate hinge. Her voice trembled with anger when she said, "You don't have to keep coming here, Elias. People are talking." He looked up slowly, the last light of the sunset glinting in his eyes. "Let 'em talk. It's my name they'll drag through the dirt," she snapped. He wiped his hands on his jeans, calm as always. "I made a promise to your father, Miss Clara. Harvest ain't done." The words hit harder than she expected. His tone was gentle but unshakable, the voice of a man who meant every word he said. She turned away, unable to speak, the ache in her chest, something she couldn't name. That night, Clara lay awake listening to the wind in the wheat. She told herself it was foolish to care what folks thought, but deep down she knew it wasn't just about gossip anymore. Elias Boone's quiet presence unsettled her. Not because she feared him, but because she was starting to need him, and needing someone she'd learned was a dangerous thing. By mid-June, the wheat fields shimmered gold beneath the sun, but peace was hard to find on the Avery farm. Clara and Elias worked side by side most mornings, not speaking much, just the scrape of tools, the low rumble of Elias's voice when he gave quiet instructions. Yet beyond the boundaries of their land, the town of Cedar Bluff had begun to spin a story all its own. It started small, a whispered remark at church, a lingering glance at the mercantile. People loved a tale, especially when it involved a young woman alone and a man who wasn't her kin. By the time summer deepened, the gossip had turned sharp. "She's letting him live there now, isn't she? He's just waiting for her to sign the deed over." A girl like that don't stay alone without a reason. Every word found its way back to Clara. Whether by accident or intent, Mrs. Branson, the banker's wife, was the first to bring it up directly. "It's not right you being out there with that cowboy every day," she said one morning while weighing sugar at the store counter. A young woman ought to be careful of her reputation. Clara's hands stilled on the counter. Her heart thudded with humiliation and anger, but her voice stayed steady. "Mr. Boone made my father a promise. That's all." Mrs. Branson smiled thinly. "Of course, dear. Promises can mean so many things." Clara left the store with her supplies and pride barely intact. On the ride home, the wind whipped her tears away before they could fall. She hated the way people assumed the worst, the way her father's name was tangled now in whispers of impropriety. When she reached the farm, she found Elias near the barn, splitting wood. His shirt clung to his back, the sweat of long hours under the sun glistening across his arms. She dismounted her horse harder than she meant to, the frustration of the day boiling over. "Do you know what they're saying in town?" she demanded. Elias paused mid-swing, setting the axe down slowly. "I reckon folks always got something to say. They think you're here because you want something from me. The land, the money, the pity." Her voice cracked. "They think I can't manage without you." He stood quiet, his gaze steady and unreadable. "Can you?" The question stopped her cold. She opened her mouth, but no words came. He didn't mean it cruelly. There was no arrogance in his tone, only truth. He stepped closer, the faint scent of cedar and dust clinging to him. "I'm here because your pa asked me to be," he said quietly. "Not because I think you can't do it, because I gave my word that you wouldn't have to do it alone." His calmness infuriated her. And yet, beneath the anger, there was a strange ache. She turned away, folding her arms tightly. "You don't understand what it's like to be the one people talk about." "No," Elias said after a moment, "but I know what it's like to have a promise hang over your head so heavy you can't breathe right unless you keep it." She faced him again, eyes shining. "And what happens when the harvest is over? When the promise is done?" He hesitated, looking out toward the endless horizon. "Then I'll go." Something in her chest twisted painfully. She wanted to tell him not to, but pride, that old companion, kept her silent. For days after, Clara avoided him as best she could. She worked in the far fields, repaired fences, and slept little. Yet every time she caught sight of him in the distance, moving with that steady, deliberate grace, she felt the tug of something stronger than pride. The gossip in town might have been cruel, but it wasn't the lies that haunted her most. It was the truth behind her fear, that maybe, just maybe, Elias Boone had already taken root in her heart, as deeply and unshakably as the promise that bound him to her father's dying wish. The heat of summer settled heavy over the plains, thick and unforgiving. The wheat was tall now, gold as a lion's mane, and the air smelled of dust and rain yet to come. For weeks, Clara and Elias had kept to their routine, though a quiet tension hung between them, the memory of that last argument still echoing in both their minds. They worked side by side in the fields without speaking much, their rhythm smooth and practiced, as though the land itself had taught them how to move together. But nature, like grief, never kept still for long. It was late afternoon when the horizon darkened. A distant rumble rolled through the air, low and warning. Clara looked up from the rows of wheat just in time to see the first flash of lightning split the sky. The wind picked up, turning warm and sharp. She felt the hairs on her arms rise. "Storm's coming," she called out to Elias. He stood by the wagon, eyes narrowed toward the clouds. "Too fast," he muttered. "That ain't no small one." Together they hurried to tie down the canvas, but the gusts tore through faster than they could work. The air turned thick with dust, whipping at their faces. The smell of ozone and rain filled the air, and then the downpour came. Within minutes, sheets of rain hammered the land. The fields began to flood, water pooling between the rows of golden wheat. Clara could barely see through the storm. She shouted over the thunder, "The west field! The grain'll be ruined!" And before Elias could stop her, she ran out into the rain. "Clara!" His voice was swallowed by the wind. The mud sucked at her boots as she ran, her dress heavy and soaked. She tried to drag a tarp over the grain sacks near the creek, but the current was already rising, fast and merciless. The thunder roared again, closer now. Her foot slipped, and in an instant she fell into the cold, churning water. Elias saw her go down. Without hesitation, he threw himself into the storm, sprinting across the flooded ground. The rain pelted his skin like stones, and the wind cut sharp as knives, but all he saw was her. He reached the creek just as she surfaced, gasping, her hands grasping for anything to hold. He waded in, fighting the current, each step a battle. When she slipped beneath again, his heart stopped cold, but then his hand found hers. "I've got you," he shouted, dragging her toward the bank. His muscles strained, boots sinking deep into the mud. The world narrowed to the sound of her coughing breath and the hammer of his pulse. When they finally reached solid ground, he lifted her into his arms and carried her back toward the farmhouse through sheets of rain. By the time they reached the porch, both were soaked through. He set her down gently, his chest heaving. She clung to him, trembling, half from cold, half from shock. "I told you not to run out there," he said, voice hoarse. You would have done the same," she whispered. He almost smiled, but his hands shook too much to hide it. "Maybe. But I've seen rivers take stronger folks than you, Clara Avery." Inside, he built a fire while she changed into dry clothes. When she came back wrapped in a quilt, he sat near the hearth, steam rising from his soaked shirt. His hands were raw, the knuckles split from the strain. She knelt beside him, noticing the cuts, the mud streaked across his arms. "You're hurt," she murmured. He shrugged. "Just water and skin." But when she reached for his hands, the look in her eyes made him go still. The firelight flickered between them, soft and golden, and for a heartbeat, the world outside didn't exist. She wanted to thank him, but words felt too small. So she just whispered, "You kept your promise." Elias looked at her, then really looked, and saw not the farmer's daughter he'd vowed to protect, but the woman she had become. The rain drummed against the roof, steady now, and though neither spoke again, both knew something had changed. That night, the storm finally passed. But something stronger had taken its place, a quiet, unspoken bond forged not in words, but in sacrifice. The storm left the land scarred but alive. The fields that hadn't been flattened by wind now stood bent and bruised, still heavy with rain. For days, Clara and Elias worked from sunrise to sundown, salvaging what they could. The barn roof needed mending, fences had collapsed, and the wheat, what little remained upright, had to be cut early. But as hard as the labor was, another kind of storm was brewing, one made of ink, paper, and debt. Clara had known her father owed the Cedar Bluff Bank some money for seed and equipment, but she never realized how much until the letter arrived. It came in an envelope sealed with red wax, the handwriting sharp and official. When she broke it open, her stomach dropped. Final notice. Payment in full is required within 30 days to avoid foreclosure of the Avery property. The signature at the bottom made her heart pound. Mr. Branson, the same man who had once shaken her father's hand in church with a smile full of false kindness. She found Elias by the barn that afternoon, repairing a fence post. The wind carried the scent of rain and wood. He looked up as she approached, the letter clutched tight in her hand. "Elias," she said quietly. "They're taking the farm if I can't pay them back in a month." He read the letter, jaw tightening as he handed it back. "How much?" $800, he whistled low under his breath. That was more money than most men saw in a year. "They know you can't pay that." "That's the point," she said bitterly. "They want the land." For a long moment he said nothing, just stared toward the fields. Then, without warning, he began untying his horse's reins. "Where are you going?" she asked, alarmed. "Town," he said. "I can find work. There's a ranch over by the river breaking wild mustangs. Pays good." Clara stepped forward, eyes wide. "Elias, that's dangerous." "You could be killed." He met her gaze evenly. "Better I take the risk than you lose your home." Her throat tightened. "I won't let you sell your life for this land." "It ain't the land," he said softly. "It's the promise." Those words silenced her. He tipped his hat, swung into the saddle, and rode off without another word, leaving behind the smell of dust and the echo of hooves fading down the road. For the first time since her father's death, Clara felt truly alone. Days passed with no sign of Elias. She worked the fields by herself, her muscles aching, her hands blistered and raw. The sun burned her skin. The wind dried her tears before they could fall. Each morning she looked toward the horizon, half expecting to see him ride back. But the fields stayed empty. The nights were the worst. She would sit by the fire, staring at the chair he used to occupy, remembering the quiet sound of his voice and the steadiness he brought to her world. Now even the silence felt hollow. Then, one evening, a shadow crossed the porch. Mr. Branson himself. He removed his hat politely, though his smile didn't reach his eyes. "Miss Avery," he said, "I wanted to see if you've reconsidered my offer." "What offer?" she asked stiffly. To sell, he said, glancing past her shoulder at the fields. I could relieve you of this burden. You've done well keeping it up on your own, but a woman shouldn't have to carry such weight alone. Clara's jaw clenched. This land was my father's life. It'll be mine until I have nothing left to give it. Branson's expression hardened. Then I'll expect payment by the end of the month. No exceptions. When he left, the sky was turning dark again. Clara stood on the porch long after, clutching her father's old pocket knife in one hand. Her heart hurt with more than worry. It hurt with the absence of Elias Boone. That night before bed, she whispered into the empty room, "Where are you?" And though no one answered, she could almost hear his voice in the wind outside. Steady, certain and far away. I'll keep my word. Clara, I promise. The days turned into weeks, and still there was no sign of Elias Boone. Each sunrise found Clara Avery standing on the porch, scanning the dirt road that wound between the wheat fields and disappeared into the hills. Each sunset found her still waiting, the light fading from her eyes along with the day. The farm felt emptier than ever. The creak of the windmill, the scrape of the barn door, the sigh of the fields, they were sounds she'd once loved. Now they only reminded her of how quiet things had become without him. She threw herself into the work. From dawn till night she plowed, fed the horses, stacked hay, and repaired what storms and time had broken. Her hands bled and her back ached, but still she kept going. The harder she worked, the less she could feel the ache of missing him. Some nights, exhaustion won, and she'd fall asleep in her father's chair beside the fire. In her dreams, she saw Elias, his hands raw from rope and wind, his voice low as he said, "You don't have to do it alone." By the third week, her savings were gone. The due date on Mr. Branson's notice crept closer with every sunrise. She counted and recounted the coins in her father's old tin box, but it wasn't enough. Then, one morning, she found something that stopped her heart. Hanging on the fence post at the edge of the field was Elias's hat, old, sweat-stained, and unmistakably his. It fluttered in the wind like a message. She ran to it, her fingers trembling as she lifted it down. He'd been here, maybe even watched from a distance. Maybe he hadn't wanted her to see him hurt. Tears welled in her eyes, but beneath the sorrow, something new stirred, determination. If Elias was out there risking his life to keep his promise, then she would keep hers too. That afternoon, Clara hitched up the wagon, packed a basket of bread and apples, and rode into town. Her dress was worn, and her boots caked with dust, but her spine was straight, her chin lifted. She wasn't going to hide anymore. The Cedar Bluff Bank stood tall and smug on the corner of Main Street, its white pillars gleaming in the noon light. Inside, the smell of ink and old paper filled the air. The clerks paused when they saw her, whispering behind ledgers. When Mr. Branson emerged from his office, surprise flickered across his face. "Miss Avery," he said smoothly, "I wasn't expecting you so soon." "I came to make you an offer," Clara said, voice clear and steady. He raised an eyebrow. "I thought we'd already discussed your lack of means." "I can't pay what my father owed," she admitted, "but I can work for it. I'll cook, clean, help at the mill, whatever you need. Every dollar I earn will go toward what's owed." Branson's smirk returned. "And what guarantee do I have that you'll keep your word?" Clara met his gaze squarely. "The same kind your bank gave my father when you took his land as collateral. Just a promise. But unlike you, I keep mine." For a long moment he said nothing. Then slowly he leaned back in his chair, studying her. "You've got spirit, I'll give you that." "Very well, Miss Avery, I'll allow it. But the rate will be low. It may take years, then years it'll be," she said, gathering the contract. As she turned to leave, one of the clerks murmured, "That Avery girl's got her father's fire." Clara didn't look back, but a small fierce smile touched her lips. Outside, the wind carried the scent of the harvest, dry wheat and coming rain. She looked toward the hills, clutching Elias's hat to her chest. Somewhere out there, he was fighting his own battles for her. She whispered into the wind, "You kept your word, Elias. Now it's my turn." That night, under the wide prairie sky, Clara worked by lantern light, her heart steadier than it had been in weeks. For the first time since her father's death, she wasn't just surviving, she was choosing. choosing to stand, to fight, to believe that somewhere beyond the horizon, the man who'd promised to protect her was still keeping his word. It was nearly the end of August when the sky began to change again, softer sunsets, cooler winds whispering through the wheat. The harvest season had come, and with it, a quiet ache that Clara Avery had learned to live with. It had been nearly a month since she'd seen Elias Boone, and though the world told her to let him go, her heart refused. Every time she looked across the fields, she could almost imagine his figure there. Tall, steady, hat tilted against the sun. The work hadn't stopped. Clara had taken on small jobs in town, cleaning the schoolhouse, baking bread for the general store, anything that might chip away at the bank's looming debt. By day she worked until her hands bled. By night she tended the fields by lantern light. The farm was surviving, barely, but she was too. Then, one golden morning, as she was gathering hay behind the barn, she heard it, the faint thud of hooves on dry earth. Her heart leapt. She turned, and there he was. Elias Boone rode up slow, his horse weary and thin, his clothes dusty, his arm bound in a rough bandage. His face was harder, leaner, but his eyes, those calm, steady eyes, were the same. For a long moment neither spoke. The world seemed to still, holding its breath. "Elias," she whispered, dropping the hay rake. He dismounted carefully, grimacing as his injured shoulder moved. "Didn't figure you'd recognize me," he said with a half-smile that didn't quite hide his exhaustion. She took a step forward, torn between anger and relief. "Where have you been?" "I thought," he cut her off gently. "Working, out west with the Briggs outfit. Breaking Mustangs, hauling fence wire. Took a few hits, but it was honest work." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch. "It ain't much, but it's near what your pa owed." Clara stared at the pouch in disbelief. "You didn't have to—" "I promised him I'd see the harvest done," he said quietly. "Couldn't do that if you lost the land." Her throat tightened. "You could have been killed." Elias shrugged, though the motion made him wince. "I've had worse." For a long while they stood in silence. The wind rippled through the wheat, the same sound it had made the day her father died. Finally Clara stepped closer, voice soft but firm. "You kept your word, Elias. But you don't owe me anything anymore." He looked at her then, his eyes unreadable. "That's where you're wrong," she frowned. "Why?" "Because it stopped being about a promise a long time ago." The words hit her like a hammer. Simple, honest, and heavy with everything he wasn't saying. Elias turned toward the field, picking up a sickle with his good hand. "Harvest won't wait for hearts to heal," he said with a faint grin. "Come on, Miss Avery. We've got work to finish." Clara hesitated, then smiled back, picking up her own sickle. Side by side, they began to cut. The rhythm came naturally, the swish of blades, the rustle of wheat, the steady breath between them. For the first time, it didn't feel like master and hired hand, or protector and ward. It felt like partners, equals. The sun climbed high, burning gold across the fields. Sweat glistened on Elias's skin, but he didn't stop. His movements were slower now, careful, the pain in his shoulder clear, but his determination never wavered. Clara tried to tell him to rest, but he only said, "Your father's land deserves to be finished by the ones who cared for it most." When evening fell, they paused at the crest of the hill. The horizon was ablaze with the colors of sunset, crimson, gold, and violet streaks stretching endlessly. Clara turned to him, her chest swelling with something she could no longer hide. "You came back," she whispered. Elias looked at her, his hat in his hand, hair wind-tossed, eyes full of quiet warmth. "Didn't reckon I ever left," he said. And in that single moment, surrounded by the sound of the harvest wind, she understood. His promise had never been just to her father. It had always been to her. The harvest moon rose early that year, big and golden, hanging low over the prairie like a lantern lit by heaven itself. The light spilled over the fields, turning the wheat into waves of fire and gold. It was the kind of night farmers waited all year for, a night of promise, of endings and beginnings. For Clara Avery and Elias Boone, it marked the end of one season and the quiet beginning of another. They had worked side by side for weeks, cutting and binding the grain, hauling it into the barn until every muscle burned. Clara had never seen Elias so driven. Even with his injured shoulder, he worked long past dusk, his breath steady, his focus unbroken. She'd tried to make him stop, afraid the wound would tear open again, but he only gave her that soft half-smile that said arguing was useless. "Can't stop now," he'd told her one evening as they loaded the last wagon. "Your father wouldn't forgive me." "And what about me?" she'd asked, half teasing, half aching. He'd looked at her then, the kind of look that reached straight through her chest. "You already have." Now, under the glow of the full moon, the last of the harvest lay waiting. The fields stretched empty and clean, the barn full to bursting with grain. The air was cool, carrying the scent of cut wheat and wood smoke. The sound of crickets filled the night. Elias leaned against the fence, his hat tilted back, watching the sky. His shirt was torn at the shoulder, hands blistered, face lined with exhaustion. And yet, Clara thought, she'd never seen anyone look more at peace. "You did it," she said quietly, stepping up beside him. He smiled faintly. "We did it." She shook her head. "No. You kept your word, Elias Boone. You finished the harvest." He took a slow breath, the weight of the moment settling in his chest. "Your father was a good man," he said, voice rough with memory. "He loved this land something fierce. But what he loved most was knowing you'd carry it on." Clara looked down at her hands, calloused, scarred, strong. "I didn't think I could," she admitted. "Not after he died. Not without—" She stopped herself, the words catching in her throat. "Without me?" Elias asked softly, her eyes lifted to his. "Without help," she said, though both of them knew what she really meant. He chuckled quietly, a sound low and warm. "You never needed me, Clara. You just needed someone to remind you you're stronger than the whole damn prairie." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was full of everything they'd left unsaid, everything they'd endured side by side. The wind rustled through the wheat stubble, carrying the soft hum of night. Then Clara reached out and took his rough, scarred hand in hers. It was warm, solid, the hand that had held her steady through grief and storm, that had worked the land beside her without complaint, that had kept a promise when most men would have walked away. "You kept your word," she whispered. Elias turned toward her, eyes catching the moonlight. "A man's word means something," he said simply. "But I reckon it means more when it's given to someone who makes keeping it worth it." Her lips parted in a breath, her heart beating fast. "Elias—" He hesitated, like a man standing on the edge of something he both feared and longed for. Then he said, voice quiet as the night, "If your father could see you now, he'd be proud." "And if he could see me," he smiled faintly, "he'd probably tell me to stop standing around and marry you already." Clara let out a startled laugh, half tear, half joy. "Would he now?" "I reckon he would." The harvest moon shone down on them, bathing the world in gold. Clara stepped closer, resting her forehead against his chest. He wrapped one arm around her, holding her there, the rhythm of his heartbeat steady beneath her ear. For the first time since her father's passing, she felt something more than grief. She felt peace. The promise had been kept. The harvest was done, and under the light of that great golden moon, a new kind of beginning quietly took root. One not bound by duty, but by love. The first frost came early that year, dusting the fields with silver before dawn. Clara woke to the chill creeping through the cracks in the farmhouse and pulled her shawl tighter. Outside, the air was sharp, the sky a pale wash of pink and blue. The harvest was long finished, the barns full, and for the first time in months, she didn't have to rush out before sunrise. But something felt different, quieter, almost too still. She went to the kitchen, expecting to find Elias Boone at the table, nursing his coffee the way he always did before starting the day. The chair was empty. His hat was gone. Her heart stumbled. On the table lay a folded piece of paper, pinned beneath her father's old pocket knife. The handwriting was rough but careful, Elias's. She sat down slowly, her hands trembling as she opened it. "Clara, by the time you read this, I'll be gone. There's work north of the river. a ranch rebuilding after the fires. They need hands, and I reckon I can help. I didn't want to wake you. Didn't think I could if I tried. I never meant to stay too long. Your father's land is safe now, and you've got a good start for next season. You're stronger than you think, Clara. You don't need a man like me hanging around to remind you. Truth is, I made 2 promises to your father. One was to finish the harvest. The other was to make sure you had the chance to live free, to make your own choices, not out of debt or duty, but out of what your heart wants. If that ever means finding me again, you know where the road runs. The words blurred as Clara blinked through tears. For a long moment, she sat frozen, the letter trembling in her hands. He was gone, again. But this time, it wasn't like before. No tragedy, no goodbye, stolen by circumstance. It was his choice. And somehow, she understood it. Elias Boone had never been a man who belonged to one place for long. The land called to him, wide open and restless. He had done what he came to do. He'd kept his word. But she also knew something else, something he hadn't written. His leaving wasn't about running. It was about giving her space to choose him, not just the memory of a promise. Clara folded the letter carefully and pressed it to her chest. The house felt empty but not hollow. The silence was different now, peaceful, not aching. She stood and walked outside. The morning sun had begun to rise, spreading gold across the frosted fields. The world was still and shining, every blade of grass tipped in white fire. She looked out over the land her father had loved, the land Elias had helped her save, and she felt something shift deep within her. She would carry on, not because Elias had left, but because he had believed she could. That evening, as she lit the lamp by the window, she found herself tracing the edge of the letter again. The last line, "You know where the road runs," echoed in her mind. She knew exactly where that was. The northern ridge, past the river, beyond the hills where the mustangs roamed free. A part of her wanted to go after him right then, to saddle the mare and ride until she found him. But she didn't, not yet. Instead, she set the letter in her father's Bible and whispered to the empty room, "When the spring comes, Elias Boone, you'd best be ready." Outside, the moon rose cold and white, glinting off the snow-dusted fields. The wind carried a faint sound, maybe the creak of the barn, maybe the ghost of distant hooves. Clara smiled faintly, heart steady for the first time in months. Elias had kept his promise. Now it was her turn to keep hers, to live, to fight, to choose. And when the road called again, she would follow it, not out of need, but out of love. Spring came slow that year, shy and soft as a child's first breath. The snow melted into silver streams that wound through the fields, and the earth stirred awake under Clara Avery's care. She had planted again, wheat, corn, and a patch of wildflowers near the fence, just because her mother had once loved them. Life had found rhythm again. The farm thrived, the debts were nearly gone, and the neighbors who once pitied her now tipped their hats with respect. Still, in the quiet hours before dawn, when the world was wrapped in mist, her thoughts always drifted north, to the man who had left with a promise and a letter, Elias Boone. It had been nearly 6 months since he rode away. Sometimes she thought she saw him in town, a flash of a tall figure near the blacksmith's, the sound of a low laugh that made her turn too quickly. But it was never him. The ache of missing him had become a steady part of her, like a heartbeat. Then, one dusky evening in early May, she heard it. The sound that had once changed her life, hooves on the dirt road. Slow, measured, familiar. Clara froze where she stood on the porch, hands still covered in flour from the day's baking. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of dust and horse sweat and something else. Something she hadn't realized she'd been waiting to breathe. Again, a lone rider crested the hill. It was him. Elias Boone rode into the yard as if the months apart had been nothing but a long day's ride. His hat was low, his coat worn from travel, but his eyes, steady, warm and searching, met hers across the fading light. For a moment, neither spoke. The only sound was the soft creak of the saddle and the slow thud of his horse's hooves. Finally, Clara found her voice. "You took your time." Elias swung down, boots hitting the earth. Figured I'd see if the farm survived without me, he said with a faint grin. It did, she replied, crossing her arms, though her heart was hammering. Turns out I can manage just fine. I don't doubt it, he said. His eyes softened. You've always been stronger than you let on. They stood there in the gold of the setting sun, the silence full of everything they hadn't said in letters that were never written. Then Clara nodded toward the barn. Your stall's still open. I didn't have the heart to sell it. Elias smiled, slow and genuine. Didn't figure you would. He led his horse to the post, then turned back to her. I went north, like I said. Helped rebuild a ranch after the fire. Made good money. Enough to buy a place of my own. She tried to smile, though her hands trembled slightly. That's good, Elias. He took a step closer. But I didn't. Her breath caught. Why not? Because it didn't feel like home. His voice was low, almost rough. Not without you in it. The world seemed to still. The breeze faded. The only thing she could hear was the pounding of her heart. Elias looked at her. Really looked, as if memorizing the lines of her face. I made your pa a promise, Clara. I kept it. But I reckon I've got one more to make. This time to you. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small box, its edges worn smooth. Inside, a silver ring caught the dying sunlight. I don't got much to offer but what these hands can build and what this heart can hold. But if you'll have me, I'll spend every harvest making sure you never have to face one alone again. Clara's vision blurred, tears slipping down her cheeks before she could stop them. She didn't speak at first, just walked forward, closed the space between them, and pressed her hand over his. You fool, she whispered, her voice breaking with a laugh. You already promised me that the day you came back. He smiled then, that rare, quiet smile that reached his eyes, and slipped the ring onto her finger. As the sun sank behind the hills, casting long shadows over the golden fields, the wind rose and carried the soft sound of laughter and something more, the promise of a future rooted in love. Not obligation, and when the harvest came again, Clara Avery and Elias Boone stood side by side, partners, hearts bound by the land, by loss, and by the promise that started it all. He had kept his word, and in the end, she had kept him.